I'm very happy to be here to be able to provide some context, historical context, political context, to the Ukrainian famine of the 1930s and why it's important for us to remember this. Because memory is important and memory of the truth is even more important. And you always know that something is very wrong when efforts are made, whether it's by individuals, by groups, or even by governments, to pretend that nothing happened. Or more subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, try to twist the truth of what actually happened at a particular point of time. Now, I was reminded of this morning when I was reading the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which reported that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, stated that, quote, "There was nothing wrong with the Soviet Union's pact with National Socialist Germany in 1939, end quote. Now, what was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? It was, of course, the pact that allowed Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to carve up Eastern and Baltic Europe between themselves and to further immerse this part of the world in imprisonment, in torture, blood, and genocide. And it's really an imprisonment that didn't end until around about 1990. The other thing, however, of which the Telegraph article reminded me this morning was that of something that's still a problem today. Now, everyone today knows about Adolf Hitler. We all know about the National Socialist regime and its barbarism. But very few people, comparatively speaking, know about Stalin, or about the Gulag, or about the purges, or about the show trials of the 1930s, or even the fact that Stalin's regime, just in terms of raw numbers, seems to have killed or been responsible for the deaths of more people than the National Socialist regime. It's estimated that something like 100 million people, and that's a low estimate, died at the hand of communists, communist movements, or communist regimes throughout the 20th century. We shouldn't be surprised by this. Marx himself, Karl Marx, died a number of years before any of his followers actually took power. But Marx himself didn't shy away from, let's call it, the radical implications of his philosophy for the social order. Quote, he wrote this: "When our turn comes," Marx warned his opponents, "we shall not disguise our terrorism." End quote. Now, Stalin and Stalinism are often portrayed as an aberration from true communism, as an aberration, something that really wasn't meant to happen by Marx's own reckoning. And in fact, during the perestroika period, some of you may remember, it was actually popular to present Lenin as this type of Marxist humanist who would never have let all the things happen under Stalin that did happen. Well, Lenin and Stalin did have their differences, which mainly had to do with Stalin's rude behavior towards Lenin's wife. And yet, you only need to read the letters of Lenin to discover that Lenin also was willing to do whatever it took in terms of state terrorism to consolidate and maintain the Bolshevik hold on power. His signature is on numerous death warrants for enemies of the people. We'll hear that a lot tonight, enemies of the people. And their executions were carried out by what was called the Cheka, which eventually became the GPU, which eventually became the NKVD, which in turn became the KGB that we all know and remember. So how is this all relevant to the Ukrainian famine and the sheer number of people that died as a result? Well, here we need to remember that Lenin was the Marxist theorist who, at the time, rather controversially, argued that a small, disciplined elite of intellectuals, like himself, of course, could, at particular points of time, speed up the inevitable direction of history and accelerate a society's march towards the communist ideal. Now, this was something that Lenin wrote about a lot, that you needed a dictatorship not of the proletariat, but for the proletariat, with people like himself as the ones who were leading the proletariat towards the end point of history. Well, Stalin took this particular insight, this particular way of thinking about how one would speed history up, very seriously, especially after Lenin's death and after Stalin began consolidating his power through the Communist Party, first of all, but then throughout the Soviet Union. He insisted, for example, that the party had to lead the Soviet Union to become more industrialized and less agricultural, because industrial society represented a faster step towards the communist end goal. Now, in practical terms, this meant state-directed industrialization of the economy. It meant the collectivization of agriculture, and it meant the designation of particular groups within the Soviet Union as obstacles to progress. Now, one such group were known as the kulaks. Now, the kulaks, this is a Soviet term, were those people who had somehow maintained some private property and who actually produced most of the Soviet Union's grain supplies. These were farmers who owned typically between 24 and 50 hectares of ground, or they even actually employed people to work for them. Now, interestingly, one of the last things that Lenin did before his death was to permit such people, the kulaks, to own private plots of land, not least because the very first efforts of collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union happened not long after the Bolsheviks seized power. And surprise, surprise, it produced enormous shortfalls of food. And Lenin was nothing if not a pragmatist when it came to making sure that the Bolshevik power remained in place. So he allowed these kulaks, as they were called, to maintain small plots of private land, and they basically provided most of the food for the Soviet Union. Now, the Ukraine which we're talking about a lot about tonight, was of course what was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. In fact, when the German Wehrmacht invaded the USSR in 1941, one of Hitler's prime objectives was to grab hold of the agricultural resources of the Ukraine, because he said it was a sure way of ensuring that the Allies would never be able to starve the Germans out as they had done during the First World War. Now, back in 1919, not long after the Bolsheviks seized power, the Ukraine had managed to achieve a type of independence. It didn't last, however. The Ukraine was reconquered by the Soviets, and the country was effectively divided on the western half by Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, while the Soviet Union took the bigger and eastern half. And what did the Soviets do when they took over? Well, immediately they began shipping large amounts of grain to feed the hungry people of Moscow and other big Russian cities. Now, coincidentally, a drought occurred in the Ukraine at precisely this moment, which resulted in widespread resentment against Lenin and the Bolshevik regime. Now, Lenin, as I mentioned, had a ruthless streak, but he also had a pragmatic streak. So to try and placate this popular resentment against the Bolshevik regime, he stopped taking out so much grain from the Ukraine and even encouraged a type of free market exchange of private goods. But from the mid-1920s onwards, Stalin comes to power and he starts to slowly reverse this process. And he begins a process of what was called Russification, in other words, encouraging more use, forcing more use of Russian language, Russian customs, Russian culture, and of course, collectivization of the economy. So in 1929, the GPU, one of the forerunners of the KGB, arrested something like 5,000, I should say, Ukrainian scholars, clergy, both Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Rite Catholics, scientists, academics, and cultural leaders. Now, they were either deported to prison camps in remote parts of Russia, or they were simply executed without any pretense of a trial. Now, from the 1930s onwards, Stalin proceeded to recommence in earnest the collectivization of the economy. So what did this mean in practice? In practice, it meant the seizure of all privately owned farmland and animals. Now, this, you need to know, is a country in which 80% of the population were traditional small farmers, often located in small villages. But this wasn't just an economic move on the part of Stalin. This wasn't just bad economics. It was also politics, because Stalin was firmly convinced that any future anti-Soviet activity was going to be led by the kulaks. And he decided that it was time to, quote, liquidate the kulaks as a class, end quote. So, having been declared enemies of the people, the kulaks were left homeless. In many cases, they were left without a single possession, as everything was taken from them, even their pots and pans. The regime, by the way, also forbade anyone from helping people who had been dispossessed of their property and land by the regime. Now, it's been estimated in this period of time, something like 10 million people were thrown out of their homes or put onto railway boxcars and deported to special settlements, as they were called, in Siberia during this period of time. It's also estimated that about a third of these people died among the frigid living conditions. These were mostly men and older boys, but also childless and unmarried women, young girls, and they effectively became slave workers in Soviet-run mines and big industrial projects. Now, back in the Ukraine, many of the people who had once been farmers were now effectively being reduced to being rural factory workers in collectivized farms. Now, anyone who refused to participate in the system at the time, in this compulsory collectivization system, was simply denounced as a kulak and deported to Siberia. Now, interestingly, the regime didn't just rely upon the stick, it also tried to use the carrots. So it embarked upon a widespread propaganda effort throughout the whole of the Ukraine. So young, eager Communist Party members would spend weeks and months in rural areas attempting to persuade people that all these changes were actually good for them and for their country. However, these attempts, not surprisingly, failed. Despite the propaganda, the ongoing coercion and threats, many farmers and farm workers continued to resist the process of collectivization, sometimes through acts of rebellion and sometimes through outright sabotage. Some of these people actually burned their own homes to the ground rather than surrender them to the Soviet regime. Some of them would try and take back their property, their tools, and their farm animals from the collective. Some of them even harassed and in some cases actually assassinated Soviet officials who were trying to enforce all this. Now, this, of course, is still the Bolshevik regime, so it didn't take very long for them to react. Soviet troops and Soviet secret police were sent to the Ukraine to basically engage in a policy of repression. They confronted the farmers, and the GPU went to work. They waged a campaign of terror that was designed to break the will of the people. And this involved GPU squads systematically attacking and sometimes simply executing uncooperative farmers. Now, even this, however, didn't break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Some of them simply refused to work at all and would just leave their crops in unharvested land. So how did Stalin respond? Well, Stalin responded by pursuing a policy of deliberate starvation, which resulted in the deaths of maybe 7 million people, if not more. So by 1932, this is the period we're talking about. By 1932, 75% of the farms in the Ukraine had been forcibly collectivized. Now, on Stalin's orders, the mandatory quotas of food that were being shipped out of the Ukraine to the rest of the Soviet Union were dramatically increased in August, October of 1932, and finally again one more time in January 1933. In the end, there was no more food left to feed the Ukrainian people. So much of the wheat crop, you may be interested to know, that was harvested by the Ukrainians in that year was sold on foreign markets. Why was it sold? Because Stalin needed the capital. He needed capital to pay for his 5-year plan for the industrialization of the Soviet Union and to help finance the build-up of his military. Now, by some estimates, if all this wheat had actually remained in the Ukraine, it would have been enough to feed Ukrainians for the next 4 years. Now, by this stage in the Ukraine, things were so bad when it came to the food supply that even Communist Party officials in the Ukraine were appealing to Moscow, asking for a reduction in the grain quotas, and they were also asking for emergency food aid. So what was Stalin's response? Stalin's response was to send thousands of ethnic Russian soldiers to purge, first of all, the Ukrainian Communist Party, and then also seal off the borders of the Ukraine to prevent any food from coming into the country. Now, if there's anything that economics tells us, it is this, that economic isolation is a quick path to economic catastrophe. And that's exactly what happened. Now, as part of the repression that's going on, GPU officers and soldiers would go house to house to house to house in the Ukraine, seizing stored up food and leaving farm families with nothing. All food was considered to be the property of the Soviet Union. Anyone caught stealing Soviet property, even an ear of corn, could just be shot outright or sent to prison for no less than 10 years. So it's hardly surprising, I think, that starvation conditions quickly prevailed all through the Ukraine. And the first, of course, to feel the effects of the malnutrition were the weakest. In other words, children and the elderly. The children became the children you would see in the streets with swollen bellies, and their arms and legs would look like sticks as they basically were being starved to death. Now, Ukrainian mothers in the Ukrainian countryside would sometimes throw their emaciated children onto railway cars that were traveling towards cities such as Kiev in the hope that someone in the cities would take pity on their children. But in the cities, children and adults had already flocked to these places from the countryside and were already dying in the streets, their bodies being carted away in wagons to be disposed of in mass graves. So while GPU officers and Communist Party officials remained very well fed, desperate Ukrainians began eating leaves off bushes and trees. Others killed dogs, cats, frogs, mice, and birds, and then would eat them. And even worse, some actually resorted to cannibalism, with parents sometimes actually eating their own dead children. Meanwhile, Soviet-controlled granaries in the Ukraine were bursting at the seams with huge amounts of grain which had not yet been shipped out of the Ukraine. In some locations, you would see grain and potatoes piled in the open, protected by barbed wire and armed GPU guards who would shoot anyone who was trying to take the food. Farm animals, which were considered necessary for production, were allowed to be fed, but the people who were living around the farm animals were left basically with nothing to eat. So by late 1933, which is really the height of the Ukrainian famine, something like 25,000 people were dying each day in the Ukraine. Now, in Europe and America and places like Canada, Ukrainians and people of Ukrainian descent, they responded to news reports of the famine by trying to send in food supplies. But Soviet authorities would halt all food shipments at the border. It was the official policy of the USSR to deny that a famine was actually going on, and therefore there was no need for outside assistance. Anyone within the Soviet Union who claimed that there was actually a famine going on would be accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda and punished accordingly. Now, the Soviets, they boosted their efforts at denial about the famine by basically duping members of the foreign press and international celebrities, of course, through carefully staged photo opportunities in the Soviet Union and in the Ukraine itself. So, the writer George Bernard Shaw visited the Soviet Union and came away with a favorable impression which he disseminated to the world. "I have seen the future," he said. Another politician, former French Premier Edouard Herriot, he was given a 5-day stage-managed tour of the Ukraine, and he viewed spruced-up streets in places like Kiev, and he inspected a model collective farm and other Potemkin villages. He came away with a very favorable impression and declared, no, there's no famine going on. Most of the foreign press corps in the Soviet Union didn't cover the famine. Some even wrote stories that were sympathetic to the official Soviet line that there was, in fact, no famine. Among these was the New York Times, interestingly, the New York Times reporter Walter Duranty, who sent one dispatch back to New York saying, quote, "All talk of famine now is ridiculous," end quote. But one has to say that outside the Soviet Union, Western governments adopted a rather passive attitude towards the famine. Most of them, in fact, knew about the famine and the suffering that was going on in the Ukraine. But Stalin's 5-year plan for the modernization and industrialization of the Soviet Union depended very heavily upon the purchase of massive amounts of manufactured goods and technology from Western countries. And many of these countries were very reluctant to risk trade agreements being upset with the Soviet Union by raising the question of the famine. So, by the end of 1933, nearly 25% of the population of the Ukraine, including 3 million estimated children, had perished. The kulaks, as a class, basically ceased to exist. Now, with his immediate objectives obtained, Stalin allowed food distribution to resume within the Ukraine, and consequently the famine started to subside. But political persecutions and further roundups of enemies of the people continued unchecked in the years following the famine. It was only interrupted in June 1941 when German troops invaded. It may surprise some people, but the German army was greeted by many, if not most, Ukrainians as liberators. Hardly surprising. But in the end, of course, the Germans simply replaced one reign of terror with another. Now, much of what I've said to you this evening is public knowledge, but it didn't become public knowledge for a very, very long time. And I think that has meant that many, if not most of us in the West today, don't really know very much about the immense sufferings of the Ukrainian people at this period of history. Now, the Ukraine, as we all know, has been in the news over the past year and a half. And one of the things I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed it, is how little reference there's been in the press to the history, the long history of Soviet repression of the Ukraine, let alone mention of the Ukrainian famine. But I think we need to remember these events, and not just because those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. That, of course, is very true. But remembering the famine, the Ukrainian famine, the famine that had a genocidal dimension, is also a way of remembering the faces, the lives, the hopes, and the suffering and the loss of perhaps 7 million people, most of whose names remain unknown to us.